I feel slightly liberated here since I've got a mic on. I don't have to stand behind the podium. Tonight, we're going to talk about what I consider the biggest topic in world politics and history over the past 150 years, which German would be die Deutsche Frage, the big question, the German question. If you look back at the 19th and 20th century, much of what happened in world politics revolved around Germany. I'm not going to steal my colleague's thunder completely here, but I have to say I'm very pleased to see a lot of our students here tonight, some who are currently struggling through my class on European and German politics. So pay close attention. This will be on the final exam. But seriously, again, let me just welcome everybody here tonight. And we're very pleased to have coming back to SMU, I think for the third time, Herr Professor Dr. Thomas Berger. And the reason Thomas has been here before is he is one of the great scholars of Japan. So you might be puzzled to wonder, what are we bringing a scholar of Japan here? But if you look at his bio, some of you may have seen it. In addition to being an expert on Japan, he is really an expert on Germany and Europe. He published a book. I think we were together at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington a few years ago, and he was working on this book. And it's a book about war, guilt, and world politics, which looks at the politics of memory, historical memory, in Japan and in Germany. Now, in addition to all of his scholarship on these questions, he has, I know he would probably be chagrined to talk too much about it, but he has very deep roots in Austria and Germany. His father, Peter Berger, is a sociologist. He followed the father eventually to Boston University before doing his undergraduate degree at Columbia. And his father's from Vienna. His mother is from Thüringen, German. So, but don't worry, he grew up in Brooklyn. So can't get more American than that.
No, Brooklyn.
So he spent a lot of time growing up in Germany and Austria, and he's going to lead us through discussion, thinking about what's going on right now in German politics and society. I know many of you in the room have followed the news from week to week, month to month, and I spent many years of my life in France. Many of you know I'm a French speaker, not a German speaker, but the French are always very fond of a word they call la crise. We're in the middle of a crisis here, and certainly in American politics, you could say there's a crise going on right now, a crisis. So we have to always try to put this in historical perspective, but especially for the students who are here. And again, I'm going to stop 1 minute. I always say the German question, and you will be tested on this eventually. It comes basically in three parts. The first part has to do with geography and territory. Wo ist Deutschland? Where is Germany? And many wars were fought over the borders of Germany, especially the eastern borders of Germany. The second dimension to the German question is strategic. What do you do with Germany? I mean, Germany is this enormous power in the middle of Europe. I will steal a little thunder and say the coming together of Europe, the building of the European community, the European Union. I think it was it Thomas Mann who said we want to have a European Germany, not a German Europe. So That's the second dimension. But I think what we're going to focus on tonight is really the third dimension, which is the big question, was ist Deutschland? Which is how do we think about German democracy and its development? Is it stable? Do we have to worry about what's going on right now in German politics? So the question of really German democracy and political development. I first met Thomas Berger. I was running some seminars at Harvard. We were all in Boston together, and I saw this really smart-looking guy come in with his briefcase from MIT as a graduate student at MIT. I don't know what year that was, sometime probably in the late 80s. And we immediately became very close friends and colleagues. So I have known him, for 35 years probably. And it has been my great privilege to know him and work with him over the years. So please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas Berger.
Well, thank you, Jim, really for this much too kind introduction. And not thank you for stealing so much of my thunder. I mean, you're already starting this lecture, and some of the things which I was going to lead off with, you've kindly taken away, or not kindly taken away from me.
What is this between friends, after all?
Absolutely. Anyways, I'm very happy to be here at the Tower Center again. I've been in this room. It's an absolutely gorgeous room, and I've been enjoying the company of Jim and some of my older friends. Diana Newton took me out. I've been meeting some new people who've been incredibly, warm and generous in their time, and I always really enjoy coming down here to SMU and to Texas in general. Now, I will also say, Jim has also outed me already as a Asian expert. One of the things when you do in Asia is you always begin with an apology. So, koresaide, konosaide, kokoro kara o habi o moshiagimasu. I mean, I'm going to have to apologize to all of you because in some ways, I mean, as Jim has already pointed out, I'm a little bit of an imposter. I don't pretend to do, German politics is not my main thing, right? I've spent a lot of time in Germany. That is true. I go back there often. I'll be there again this summer. And I have taught German politics and European politics, so I guess I'm sort of ethically and professionally obliged to claim some level of expertise. But if you're going to get me into the intricacies, for example, the German electoral system, I was talking earlier about the Wahlrecht, I can't do it. By the way, I'm in good company. Over 50% of the German population doesn't understand how their electoral system works. So it's not quite that bad. But I don't do German comparative politics that much, but I do want to talk about the Krise, the crisis in Germany, and it's gone very fast. I mean, just a few years ago, it seemed like Germany was again, Exportmeister Deutschland, this tremendously powerful, successful country, which was powering its way through a sort of kind of model for the rest of the world. And then, the mood shifts very quickly. And I remember just 2 years ago, I was in Germany, and suddenly, some of this had to do with the Ukraine war, but there's actually a lot more going on in Germany. There's this kind of sense of crisis. And if you take a look at German media, and I followed the German media quite closely, you talk with your German friends, there is a mood that something is amiss in Germany. And there are a number of reasons for it. And I'm going to touch on, there are economic problems, and they are serious economic problems. There are obviously the geostrategic situation in Europe as a whole has taken on a rather new complexion, and one which the Germans have to deal with. And what's right now, and what Jim wanted me to talk about, and which is, again, in some ways, something that I do have to deal with, it's the rise of the far right in Germany, and particularly the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, which has some implications for how German politics is functioning today and will probably be functioning in the future. And there's if you take a look at public opinion polls, and I look at a lot of the opinion data, and you have to read it with a great deal of care. How you ask the question leads, and when you ask a question leads to very different results. I think, and I looked at a whole bunch of these, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, various academics have been polling the German public, and there's a little bit of a glass half full, half empty. There is a strong sense. I have actually a whole bunch of data. I have it on my computer, but I'm not going to bore you with it, which shows that Germans are quite solidly in favor of democracy. We're not looking here at some kind of fascist takeover in Germany. There's a strong public opinion data, 30-40% are very strongly behind it. You get well over 70-80% in favor of a democratic system. If, however, you ask the question, how are you happy with the functioning of the German political system? You get a very different result. I mean, you are seeing considerable discontent. And it takes different forms. Some of it, everyday life. I don't know if any of you have been to Germany recently, but even the famous Deutsche Bundesbahn does not arrive on time. I sometimes trying to get from Heidelberg, where I spent my summers, to Frankfurt Airport. I give myself 3 hours now, because the Bahn fällt aus wieder. I mean, it is catastrophic. Even the German football team right now, the Nationalmannschaft, the soccer team, is not doing well. So, already at this level, Germans are unhappy. But there are more serious problems than that. There is a set of problems which they're facing. And the AfD has become a major focus. For a long time, and I'm going to speak a little bit more about this, but the far right was an absolutely taboo theme. The notion of a far right party becoming part of the political firmament. There's always been in German society and European society, democratic, successful democracies all over, there's always been a hard right spectrum of opinion. Josef Joffe, who some of you may know of, I remember talking to him years about, he said it's about 10% of the public has really strong, what we could call, and then depends on how you define it, not defend it, but I mean, how do you define it? It's sort of looking for a strong leadership, ready to overcome what we would view as democratic norms, a level of xenophobia. I mean, this, certain complex of ideas, different countries, they're defined in different ways, but you will find that in Germany, it's elsewhere. And however, in the German system, allowing that spectrum of opinion to become organized and represented in the German political system has been a taboo for obvious historical reasons, right? I mean, I'll come back more to this recently. And we had just in the last few weeks, I think those of you who followed the American media as well, New York Times, Washington Post, I'm sure that here in Dallas, the newspapers covered this to some extent. We had a very interesting meeting. Some far-right leaders met with AfD, some members of the AfD in Potsdam, outside of Berlin, lovely town. It was a private meeting. But they were talking about how to deal with the immigration crisis, which is a serious threat, serious issue that they have to get on top of. And some of the leaders, some of the people who were there were had these ideas. They suggested, I don't know if you followed this, but that we need to do what they called re-immigration, in effect, deportation, not only of asylum seekers, but also not only of what one would call non-documented or irregular people in the German system, but also people who are not properly assimilated in the German system, both people with long-term and possibly German citizenship, right? Should be, if either, you become part of us or you shouldn't be here, kind of thing. And then they also talked about how do we pursue that campaign, how are courts and media getting in the way, how do we weaken this? A rather disturbing trend. Now, and in the German context, this led to this was leaked, a German investigative site, I think Correctiv, I think they're called, got hold of this information. They spread it to the public, and it's, of course, some of you are sort of looking a little bit at askance. In the German context, this is actually a bombshell. I mean, the immediate association, again, it's different, but then sort of association is with the Wannsee Conference. The secret planning of the Holocaust, which took place. And so, and you had a concomitant, dementsprechend response in the German civil society. You have had the largest demonstrations of people taking to the streets peacefully, but, since I would say the 1980s, early 1980s, at the time of the Euro missile crisis, you saw about 400,000, 500,000 probably across the country, well over 1 million people demonstrated. And this is seen as a threat to democracy. So there's a sense of crisis, and a lot of it has to do with a variety of things. And one of the phrases, one of the bugbears of those who studied German politics is, are we seeing a Weimarization, right, of German politics? I mean, after all, we had, after World War I, in many ways, a vibrant, genuinely democratic system with, which was in some ways quite successful, intellectually, artistically. People committed to a democratic order, and it collapsed. Yeah, one of the things which the Germans have obsessed with, and which outside observers have said, is there going to be a Weimarization? Is there going to be a collapse or a real sort of right-wing, hard right-wing turn in the German political system? Now, I think, and I'm going to just sort of telegraph my, it should be obvious to you, Germany is very far from that kind of Weimarization. Yeah, the Weimarization type 1, which we're terrified, and I will briefly say something about it. This is absurd. Even though I've had very serious people, including some in Germany, some coming up to me full of angst, a nice German term, that are we headed for this kind of thing? I would, however, like to say, as a political scientist, that there is a kind of Weimarization with a type 2, a kind of the softer version of Weimarization, which has been actually unfolding for a long time in the German political system. And it will have implications for how the German democracy works. So the good news is, no, we're not watching a Machtergreifung anytime soon, thank God. But there is some bad news, which is that the German political system is becoming trickier, creakier. In some ways, it's normalizing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah, I'm going to talk about crisis. Now, as Jim says, the Germans are an angstvolle people. One of their strengths is that they are worried about crisis all the time. In my own lifetime, I first went as an adult to Germany around 1979. This was when the US was deploying a new generation of neutron bomb, new generation of nuclear weapons. Soon we would follow this with Pershing II and cruise missiles deployed. And I saw, again, very large demonstrations. And my uncle, who was a German, says, I was going to a German university, Frankfurt University, and says, stay away from the politics, don't, right? Because the students are all very upset. And so, so I saw crisis, and I saw very large demonstrations then. And there was a sense, this was at the height of the Cold War, the reignition, mourning in America, but Götterdämmerung maybe in Germany. There was a little bit of fear that you were going to have a real kind of scenario developing in Germany at that time, crisis. I was doing my PhD research in Germany during the fall of the Berlin Wall. I remember I was there when the Berlin Wall fell. I was doing interviews in Bonn with people in the German government. And that was an extraordinary crisis in some ways. I mean, suddenly you have, right, 17 million people who have to be integrated in the German system. The very framework of European international politics was now being thrown open. Crisis again. In the late 1990s, when I was beginning to teach German politics, economics was high on the list. There was a whole debate, some of you who are in business may remember, I know Thomas will know this, Standortdebatte, Standort Deutschland, the debate, can Germany remain competitive? And at that time, Germany felt it was falling further and further behind in terms of trying to stay competitive with East Asia, staying competitive with the United States in high tech. Yeah. And again, it seemed almost insoluble from the point of view of people on the ground. So, if I go through this, and by the way, since Jim outed my family history, this is nothing compared to the crises that my family went through. Yeah. I mean, my father was a refugee from Vienna. He was Christian, but he was of Jewish extraction. And when the Nazis came in, 38, he got out of there as fast as he could, which he succeeded. Those who didn't were killed. So that was real crisis. My mother was a good Prussian, grew up in Thuringen, and she went through the war with the bombings and the occupations. They were occupied first by the British, then the Americans, then the Russians. They got traded their territory. So she actually had a sort of kind of a smorgasbord of occupying armies. And that was a real crisis. Just one little piece of data which I remember. In her high school, which was in the countryside, not a single boy survived. Not a single boy from her class lived. They all died mostly on the Eastern Front. So that was a real crisis. So the Germans are connoisseurs of crisis. Now, this is not simple. And so maybe, obviously, now that was a real disaster. But and I refer to that crisis, the Deutsche Frage in this sort of large sense, the crisis of how can Europe manage being in the center of Europe, and how can Europe manage with having a Germany with its potential power and its particular attitudes at that time period. Can they handle that? That was a crisis that they failed. And what came out of the German political system, this is where, and this becomes worth talking about, was an absolute determination by the Germans not to allow this kind of crisis to take them over. I mean, you literally out of the soot and ashes, people are coming and they're trying to figure out how are we going to manage this. And what they did, and I'm going to focus on the politics, what they did was they created a political system which in some ways is almost sort of like the Mercedes-Benz, right, of political systems. I mean, it is fine-tuned, sophisticated, complicated mechanically, and not just in terms of the electoral system, luxurious, and very safe. I had a friend who taught at the University of Constance, and his family lived in Bonn, and he used to drive the 600 kilometers from and once, at night, he was a little bit too tired and he got too close to the side of the road, a cliff. It took off half the door. But the machine ran. He was perfectly safe and it continued to run. And he said, well, why not? And he drove the next 300 kilometers back home. So those Mercedes-Benz, those old Mercedes-Benz, don't try this at home. But I mean, those were real stable machines. But and that German system is built basically upon mechanisms which build consensus. In multiple ways, the German system is a system which is designed to force people to work together. This begins with the way, and actually, this morning I went to Kubi's, and I'm absolutely amazed at the German presence, even there at the breakfast table of German culture in some parts of Texas. And the gentleman who was working there is a butcher from Germany with a Meisterzeugnis. He's you know him even. To become a Meisterwerk, and I could even see, to become somebody who's recognized as a master, you have to go through a long training system. And that training system has been negotiated between the Guild of Butchers. There's something like a butchers guild, and they're working with the government to create a training and a certification system. And so you get excellent, well-integrated butchers. The butchers, but that system, which becomes in the German Deutsche Handelskammer, Industry and Handelskammer, this is agreed between private and state actors. They come together. You will find this in electricians. You will find this with masons. You will, on every level of German society, things are carefully calibrated. Groups are brought into the German system. Political scientists, and those of you who are the students here, I look meaningfully at you. It's called neo-corporatism, right? It is a neo-corporatist arrangement. You find this not only at the micro level, you find this at the macro level. You find this in the German political economic philosophy, which has been since World War II. The soziale Marktwirtschaft idea is based on the notion of a partnership, that there should be a partnership between the workers, the management, professional groups, the churches, are brought in, every sector of society. The way the Bundestag works and the German cabinet system works, and I won't go into the details, also forces, for example, many of the top positions, like the Bundespräsident, who sort of represented the head of state, but not the head of government. The chancellor is the head of government. The head of state, who does the symbolic role, has to be voted in by a supermajority. That requires inter-party cooperation. Supreme Court judges. And this whole system is designed for building consensus in order to make sure that you have a system that works. I taught in Germany, by the way. I've talked with Thomas about this. Even when you're on the faculty, many of you complain about, those of you at SMU complain about university bureaucracy. You have no idea what it's like. I mean, it is, the students are represented, the plumbers are represented, of course, the administration, and yes, some of the professors as well. Everyone has to be brought in. Now, this system in terms of, now let's talk about the party political system in Germany. And I'm going to skip over some of the other things I was going to say, but the party political system in Germany was also from the beginning carefully designed for stability. One of the decisions that they made was what's called the wehrhafte Demokratie, a democracy that can defend itself. And now again, this is the experience of the Weimar Republic. Some of the different things which I'm saying actually fit together. They're not just a random set of anecdotes. You had there a case where the democratic system self-destructed. They elected Hitler with a plurality, not a majority. And then because other actors in the German political system played along with him, you created the conditions for a rapid takeover. Now, those conditions by then were much more difficult. I could go on at length about just how extreme the situation was in Germany. It takes a lot to make a democratic system implode. But you did have a democratic mechanism allowing the creation of a dictatorship. And so the Germans made a decision which is very different from us. Again, the American democracy and the German democracy have many similarities, but there's some fundamental differences. And one of them is with the notion of limitations on freedom of speech and freedom of association, at least especially in the early days of the Federal Republic. This is the notion that, and I can give you lots of examples about this, but certain political groups are not going to be allowed. You began by outlawing the Communist Party. Again, during the Weimar period, they regularly got about 10% of the vote. They were represented in the German political system. In the context of a divided Germany in the Cold War, right? Okay, out with the hard left. Then the decision was, of course, we're not going to allow a Nazi successor party to come in. So the Nazis were forbidden. And what that also means is that if a group, and then you have what the Germans call the Bundesverfassungsschutz, this is the special office for the protection of the Constitution. And any party which does not adhere to the fundamental democratic norms of the German political system will not be allowed to function. That doesn't mean they're going to go and round you up and arrest you. It means you're not allowed to have, for example, a bank account. You're not allowed to organize, can't put yourself on the ballot. And also what is quite important sometimes is just the stigma that's associated with being part of a far right group. Now, if you are identified like that, for example, people who have told me you couldn't get hired at a bank. They might say, yeah, this person, we don't find this the kind of person we would want to have in our organization. So beyond the sort of legal jurisprudential tools, the German system simply said, we are not going to have these far extremes. And what you had instead in the German political system is you had basically two major parties, the Christian Democratic Party, the CDU-CSU. The CSU is called the Socialist Union, but it's anything but socialist, quite the opposite. It's based in Bavaria, but they have a close strategic partnership with the Christian Democrats. And they represent the sort of right of center. And the famous line of Franz Josef Strauss, who was one of the major leaders of the CSU, said there should be nothing ever to the right of the CSU. The Germans we will not accept that. And then on the left of center, you had the Social Democrats. And the Social Democrats also went through, in the early days of the Federal Republic, they went through a transformation. They got rid of some of their class warfare ideology. They dropped their opposition to NATO, and they became what they call a Volkspartei, which means a people's party trying to appeal to a broad mass. And in between these two political camps, you had this Free Democratic Party, the FDP, which acted as sort of the balance. The German phrase is the Zünglein an der Waage, right? If the CDU was going too far in one direction, they could join with the SPD. If the SPD was going and they disagreed with too far, they would go and join with the FDP. And this created a very sort of stable party system in which this consensus landscape operated. In the 1980s, really late 70s, you had the Greens. You had the 1968 generation. You had a sort of student uprising in Germany, as you had in the United States and in France, but it was quite a generational shift. I would say in some ways, culturally, it was an even bigger shift, or at least as big a shift in the German context as it was here. And out of that came a political movement who were dissatisfied with who were both dissatisfied with the policies of the left of center. They were especially against nuclear power. They were against also NATO. They were a pacifist party. So they would change a little bit on that. And you had now a new color. Now, by the way, in German, just for, again, for entertainment's sake, the German parties have colors. Okay, you've got black, the clerical garb, Christian Democrats represent you have gold, which is the FDP, represent business, professional class. They sometimes they embarrass themselves by saying we're part of the well-earning part of society, which was even for them overly elitist. And then you have the red, the Social Democrats. And this was the sort of, and this, by the way, these are the colors for those of you who immediately know, the colors of the German flag, accidentally. So you had the German flag. Now you have a splotch of green, kind of upsetting the color balance. Then we had this next crisis, which the Germans managed, which was, of course, unification of Germany. And you had to bring in 17 million people into the political system. Now, initially, by the way, the different political parties, and especially the CDU, the chancellor at the time was Helmut Kohl, they were quite successful in appealing to the East Germans. But this was and those of you, again, who study political science, this was what we call a transitional moment. And you had people who were left out of the transition into the new system. And many of the East Germans, and again, by a few wonderful films, if you watch something like Farewell Lenin, or if you watch another great film, what was it called again? The Lives of Others. Wonderful films about how much of a transformation this was and how difficult this transformation was. And there were groups of people who could not be and were felt alienated in East Germany from this new German state. Actually, the end of the Farewell, Lenin Farewell, without going into details, the hero says, talking about unification, he grew up in East Germany. He said, I gained a fatherland, but I lost a motherland. For many of the East Germans, they felt an attachment to the old system. They call it, instead of nostalgia, nostalgie in German, they call it Ostalgie, a kind of longing for the old East. And of course, there are also concrete interests, because in the new system, people who had been associated with the old Communist Party, the SED, the Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschland, the Communist Party, they were pushed out of the bureaucracy. They were pushed out of leadership positions. And this group of people joined with the more left-wing elements in West Germany, and they formed a new party, the Linkspartei Bündnis 90 in those days. Leaders, with the Greens, sorry, but then you had people who split off, and we had the left party emerging. And so now you had a new color. They picked, I think, purple in the end. So now you've got a German flag with a splotch of green and a splotch of purple. And it gets more complicated. And now we have had, now 2008, 2009, we had the financial crisis. And the beginning in the United States, but springing over to Europe very quickly. And we had, in some ways, a more dangerous financial crisis in Europe than in the United States. And what we had, the added complication was we had the euro, and this crisis was in the Eurozone. And some of my friends who I used to work with had been warning me for a long time that this whole euro thing is a bomb waiting to explode. And we had a protest party emerging, Alternative für Deutschland. Originally, the leaders of Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, were economists, rather mild-mannered academic types, would be sort of like Jim and me, decided to get into politics and protest U.S. Treasury policy. They were not particularly right-wing in the sort of sense that it would later become, but they had an issue to run on. That is, we had this, what was happening in particular in the context of the financial crisis is that we had a violation of the original treaty of European, which created the Maastricht Treaty, which created the EU, the euro. But you saw de facto transfers, right, and taking over of liability by the European Union as a whole for the financial problems of Europe, especially in the South, because the crisis began in Greece, sprang over to Spain and Portugal, hopped over to Ireland, and then, of course, Italy was on the line. And Italy, as that crisis began to emerge, too big to fail, too big to bail. I mean, this was going to be a real problem. So there was a serious economic problem, serious concerns in Germany that we are now entering into a different kind of Eurozone than we thought we had joined with. And they got protests. And then following that crisis, another crisis unfortunately followed, which was the Arab Spring, which began to generate large numbers of refugees coming to Europe as a whole. And again, I was in Europe at the time. Some of you may have been. These were extraordinary scenes that you were seeing of boats landing in Lampedusa, people hiking in Vienna and Austria in the countryside and seeing groups of Syrians sleeping on the road, right, where you used to hike in the countryside. And you had, again, a huge crisis inside of the German system. And by the way, Angela Merkel was then the chancellor in Germany, a Christian Democrat. And she famously said, at first she resisted this, and then I think we talked about this last night. One mustn't forget that she is the daughter of a Protestant minister. And at a certain point, she actually came to sort of looked inside her soul and said, to use the phrase that Martin Luther said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Right? I have to now do something about these people. And she made a decision over the advice of some of her own people. Thomas de Maizière was the head of the internal ministry, the Innenministerium, which is the frontline ministry in affairs. And he warned her that this was not going to go well. But she said, "Wir schaffen das schon." No, yeah, wir schaffen das schon. We can manage this. We can do it. And they did. And those of you who remember, she became Woman of the Year. Time put her on the front page. You had an outpouring also from German civil society. We can do this. We're going to welcome foreigners. In some ways, by the way, on a moral level, you can see it for people who want to, we are now making up, we are not this kind of xenophobic, racist German of the past. We are an open Germany. Great. But unfortunately, as we all know, migration is a difficult issue to handle. And the greatest danger of migration, and Jim and I were talking about this, and he agrees with me on this front, and as it's very difficult to control migration in general. Every country has problems with that, including our own. You can do something, but there are costs. But one of the most critical things on a political level is you must maintain the illusion of control. The minute the public thinks that the state is no longer in charge of borders, no longer, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be political here, but this is something which you can see in case after case after case, including in Europe. The minute the state has the population or large segments of the population feels that the state is no longer in charge of the borders, a kind of panic sets in. And this was in some ways predictable. And we saw that panic, and the AfD, and particularly not the AfD, but people who are joining the AfD, but with a much harder right-wing point of view, then took the AfD in a much harder anti-immigrant stance. Okay? And again, what we have, then the AfD really became part of the German political landscape. And we have seen multiple right-wing parties in Germany before, but they have disappeared, partly because of governmental, right, the Verfassungsschutz, but they haven't outlawed parties for a long time, partly because it's taboo, but now you have a new clientele, and particularly you have the clientele who votes for the AfD. It tends to be men more than women. It tends to be people who are of sort of lower middle class, working class background. That does not mean they're uneducated, does not mean they're poor or unemployed, but they are people who often might feel potential challenge in their work situation from or competition with foreign workers and foreigners. And the other important element, here we come back, different parts of what my talk fit together, they particularly were well received in the former East German states, the Neue Bundesländer of East Germany, including my mother's home state of Thuringia. And a new type of leadership emerged in some of these places. If you have a chance, take a look at Bernd Höcke. He's the head of the AfD in Thuringia. And whether he must be conscious of this, he sounds like he's channeling the spirit of Adolf Hitler almost. I mean, the language, the gestures, I mean, it's quite radical, you know. And you now have this party, which is quite strong. And the AfD now, according to German public opinion polls, there's something called the Sonntagfrage, which it gets taken, you've got this sort of, Germans poll themselves endlessly, and then but they do it really systematically. So it's like everything else. And so you just get these fantastic tables. But for the last year or so, they're about 25, now over 30% of, if the election were held today, 30% of the German electorate would vote for them. Yeah. They are now the second largest party in the German, political system. The CDU, CSU, who are out of power, is number one. They're around 35 to 38%. The old SPD is now dropped way down. The Greens have not done so well. They've gone back up and down. But they have now emerged. Now there's a debate in Germany, especially after there's also been, by the way, slowly, there have been a number of incidents, which I won't get into, about far right figures. But there's now a debate, should we now outlaw the AfD? Use this instrument that we have to, again, close down the political system. And the answer, I think, probably, I mean, there's a debate about it, it's not closed, probably the answer should be no. Because if you do this now, you're going to disenfranchise significant segments of the German public, including with this strong regional element in East Germany. So I personally think it's going to be very difficult. So we've got the AfD. Now the question, so now, black, red, gold, green, purple, and I hate to say it now, they use a light blue for their color. But if you're going to be nasty, brown, we've got it's Weimarization. I mean, without going into the history of the Weimar Republic, I mean, you've got multiple political parties, and you've got a broad spectrum of opinion. Now, I'm not going to call the AfD Nazis, because there are some people in there who are Nazis. There are people who have connections, by the way, with there have been some unpleasant right-wing terrorist groups, including the most spectacular one, some of you may remember, about 2 years ago, was something called the Reichsbürger movement, where we had this crazy group of about initially 25, it got up to 60 people, including some people with connections with the AfD, including some people who had connections with the German military, including a couple of former colonels who were planning assassinations in a kind of coup attempt. These people are what the Germans would call Spinnern. They're nuts, but they exist, So again, that heightens the sense of fear. But like it or not, now we've got a multi-party system that is which is in a system which is built for consensus. We are now going to see, by the way, now again, if you look again at the surveys which are done of AfD voters, they come from diverse backgrounds. There are also many people in the West. It's not like it's a purely East German movement. And if you look at their ideological predispositions, some of them are hard right, many of them are not. Some of them were former social democratic voters, SPD voters. There are even some who are Greens who have gone over. It's a diverse group of people. The numbers of people who have views, and if you ask them on questions, how do you feel about foreigners? What do you feel about the press? What do you feel about the role of how state power is being used? What do you feel about criminality? There's a whole range of questions which you can ask to try to gauge this. The numbers who have what we would normally view as hard right views is maybe a quarter. of the AfD. Over half of the AfD shares some of these views in different measures. There are also a lot of protest voters. This becomes important for a minute too. There are just a lot of people who are not happy about how the economy is going. They're not happy about the trains. They're not happy about the football team. I mean, there's a lot of dissatisfaction. And for a way of registering your point of view, your negative point of view, you vote for the AfD. That's showing them. Also, a fair number of young people. That's another thing which I could talk to you about, but weird stuff like Nazi rock. I mean, if you're a young person, you really want to shock the older generation, do some of that kind of skinhead stuff, and that gets them. Okay, I'll stop here. So now the problem is what do you do with them? Now, in the short term, we have what they call a firewall. So like in France, vis-a-vis the Marine Le Pen and it used to be the Front National, now they're the Assemblée Nationale, the hard right in the French context. There's an effort by the established parties not to keep them out of the political system. Friedrich Merz, who's the head of the CDU, and there have been some rumblings, especially from CDU politicians who are in the East, who say we've got to work with them. Right, they're now, how are we going to make any kind of policies on things like roads and education unless we work with the AfD? And Merz and the CDU says we're going to lose more voters if we turn to the right, and we're going to gain. Right, we're going to lose more voters in the center, and then we're going to gain on the right. We cannot. Franz Josef Strauss was right. We can't let these guys, exist. So there's right now a kind of firewall attitude. It's going to be difficult in the German system to operate over time. With this new constellation. I'm going to talk about Austria for 1 second. And I was again reading in Politico. I read a lot of, by the way, I read a whole range of, whenever I look at a country, for those of you who want to do this, you should study. For example, in the United States, if you read the New York Times, you should read also the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, right? You've got, if you're in Germany, you should read Der Spiegel and the FAZ. Die Zeit, one of my relatives, Dönhoff, and Joffe was there too. The Gräfin Dönhoff founded it, so I have a especially warm heart for the Zeit. But in any case, I'm going to have to say the FAZ and the Der Spiegel. In Britain, it would be some, I would say, the Tory Telegraph, and the Guardian. But in any case, I think that you've got to bring. They're going to have to bring so right now they're saying no AfD, but they're going to have to find some way of doing this over time. The hope is that if we can get over the set of crises we have now, beginning with immigration, because the number one issue in Germany, as in many ways here in the United States, if you take a look at what motivates voters for the far right, it is mishandling of the immigration issue, their perception of a mishandling. So I think the Germans do have to do that. But in the longer run, you've got to bring these people into the system. In Austria, they already did this. And I was reading Politico, and they were talking about how the FP, the Freedom Party in Austria, the FPÖ is on the rise. They are actually, there's a parallel development in Austria going on. But actually, the FPÖ, which the article doesn't mention, have been in power multiple times. The first time the far right came into power in Austria was in 1970. And the chancellor at that time was Bruno Kreisky, who was Jewish and a social democrat. And the calculation has been, it's been difficult. I'm not going to say Austria is a model. It's not the hills are alive with Sound of Music in Austria either. But the calculation was, and to some extent they're correct, you bring them in, but they have to be brought in on terms which are acceptable with our democratic order. It has to be a bargaining process. And I think and the way the Germans are going to work would be easy for me to say the German system is going to have to change. The Weimarization, the small Weimarization, is that the business of creating coalitions, of aggregating interests is going to become more difficult in Germany moving forward. But what the answer to it is just more of what the Germans always do, sitting and talking and building consensus. And I have enough confidence that they will overcome this crisis. But this time the problem is, like that Mercedes-Benz, not just the door has come off, not just the tires kind of going flat. There's some problems with the steering system. And that's how I'm going to end.
Oh,
So
okay.
sorry to go
Thank
on
you.
so
Yeah.
long.
So Thomas,
I sit down here.
yeah, I think you have to sit down, but I can't see the audience if I'm sitting, so I got to stand up so I can see you. But, and we're already running a bit late, so I'm going to take as many questions as we possibly can. We'll probably collect a few questions because I know there are going to be a lot of questions, but I have the prerogative of the first question. For the past couple of decades, during the Merkel period, you had the grand coalition governments. And we all know that when you bring the two major parties together and put them in the government together, a lot of people in the country feel like there's no choice. So, you really, and that seems to invite dissent, encourage the extremes. So I just wanted to ask you, what do you think about these grand coalition arrangements? And you can stay seated while you answer the question.
Okay, this is supposed to be the conversational part. Sometimes I sit back and, I mean, there's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah. We'll do it in
So
one
look,
minute.
1 minute. Look, in the short run, I think what they're looking for, that we're going to have a next election is going to come by October 25th, I think,
Yeah.
2025.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a parliamentary system. They could call elections sooner, right? But it's in the next year or so, this is going to become a very real question.
Yeah.
And the question is, what kind of coalition are you going to build?
Yeah.
And I think the preferred coalition, just in terms of sheer mathematical possibilities it's going to be CDU-led, and they want to bring in the FDP, and they want to bring in the Greens, which sounds crazy, but you get these really kind of odd combinations. The current coalition right now is also with the Greens and the FDP, right, in the same party, and they're going at it hammer and tongs. I mean, they're having a very hard time building consensus as it is now. It may not be numerically possible. And one of the peculiarities of the German system, again, lessons of the Weimar period, is that they have a requirement that, and there's some exceptions to this, but a party needs to get over 5% of the vote to be represented in the German legislature, the Bundestag. And the FDP is just skirting that. And there's a real possibility the FDP, which has happened to them in the past, will get less than 5%, in which case they won't get represented, in which case you can't build a coalition. Yeah. And then the only alternative is a GroKo, a grand coalition. Now, Angela Merkel did a GroKo. She did two of them, I think, as I recall. And it was not a fun experience for anybody involved. The other grand coalition was a brief period in the late 1960s. And again, the experience there was shorter than the Merkel one. It was negative for precisely what you said. The fear was that when you have this, and this is again a function of that German political system, which is so built on consensus, it's a sense that there's sort of insiders and outsiders. And it creates a sense that the system, the leaders, folks up there are not listening to us. And it therefore encourages extremism on both the right end of the political spectrum and possibly on the left. So they want to avoid that, but it may not be avoidable. And so in the short, medium term, I actually kind of see a good chance of a grand coalition coming.
Well, we didn't get into the strategic dimension of the German question, and we're probably not going to have a whole lot of time to do that. But before I turn to the audience, I just want to place that on the table. There's something going on in Ukraine. There's a question about the future of NATO, a question about how Germany is going to confront the Russian threat. All of these things are looming. So I think it's safe to say the strategic picture in Europe is evolving rapidly, and it's putting Germany and Olaf Scholz in a very, very difficult position. But I want to go to the audience, and
I'll say one thing: puts Europe in a difficult position, because for there to be an effective creation of not just not a sort of de Gaullean, strategically autonomous Europe, but if there's going to be a more effective European-led pillar of defense, Germany is going to have to be a central part of it.
Yeah.
And right after this is the whole Zeitenwende debate, but right after the February 22nd invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Scholz made a speech, right? He says the times have changed, we're at an inflection point in European history, the Zeitenwende. And Germany must, he said, boldly take the lead. And he put money where his mouth was. He created a special budget of 100 billion euros, which was supposed to be used exclusively for military procurement. The Zeitenwende has become the Zeitenwendchen, right? It's this, they have not done 2 years into it as much as they should. Now, they had some other stuff on their plate, but one of the things which is a bottom line of my talk is it's going to be difficult for them to play that kind of leadership, and certainly the kind of leadership which some people thought they might play. Right? Germany emerging as a kind of, brother in arms, literally, with Britain and France in terms of leading defense. This is going to be very difficult for a variety of reasons, including the political system.
Okay, I want to open it up for questions, and Mr. Rulin.
So, as was previously mentioned, you know a fair bit about.
We're bringing microphones around, by the way, so it's all being recorded. So, yeah.
So, as was previously mentioned, you know quite a bit about Japan as well as Germany. I just wanted to ask, since Germany and Japan are obviously have a shared history together, and especially in regards to World War II. And today, both countries are known to have very different sort of policies in regards to reconciliation and sort of apologies for their crimes, for their actions during the war. Would you say that's a sort of diplomatic sore spot or causes tension between the two countries?
Well, it doesn't cause tension between Germany and Japan. They have very different approaches. I wrote a book on this subject. I think I was speaking with, but I think Dave was earlier here. This morning at Kubi's, I was getting very boring on this subject, which is my danger when you ask me about my research. Ichido hanasu to kiri ga nai. But it's a problem for, look, the main point which I would say, there are a couple of points. First of all, there's this kind of exaggeration that Germans are sort of the Musterknabe, the model school student for dealing with the past. It's been much more difficult for the Germans. And in case you think that giving sincere apologies can end these issues, it hasn't. And we've had a change of government in Warsaw recently, but it was absolutely shocking in some ways how during the Kaczynski period in Poland, we saw this whole history being brought up, and new demands for increased reparations. And so unfortunately, as Tennessee Williams, no, it was Faulkner said, the past is not only dead, it isn't even past.
Yeah.
I mean, we just can't get away from it. Now, the Germans, for a variety of reasons, which had to do with the situation that they found themselves in, above all, were forced to deal with these issues in a way that the Japanese weren't. And Jim and I were talking about people we used to know, and I had a terrible experience, and I will tell this as an anecdote and hope that it's not taken the wrong way, but I was applying for a fellowship at Harvard, and the head of the fellowship was the former dean, a man named Henry Rossowski. Henry Rossowski, a very prominent economist of Japan, and the reason he became interested in Japan was because as a young man, he fled Estonia as a young Jewish man and escaped to Shanghai, where the Japanese protect him. And he asked me precisely the question you asked. So you're actually creating me a kind of trauma experienced. And so I gave my standard answers at that time. And then Henry, who's passed away since, said, no, Tom, come on. The problem was that the Japanese killed Chinese and Koreans. and the Germans killed Jews, and Henry being Jewish, and we weren't going to let them forget it. And of course, you can now. I went, the Jews control finance in the U.S. government. And how am I going to answer this kind of question? And I kind of fell apart, and I didn't get the grant. I got it next year.
Let's take more questions.
But the main point is a serious point, and it had to do with the nature of the power relations. The Germans were in a situation where they had to apologize, and the Japanese not at that time.
We have a microphone over here. Why don't we take a question from this side of the room? Yes, please stand up and introduce yourself.
Great talk. My name is David Cam. My question is about German automobiles, since you mentioned about Mercedes-Benz earlier. So this may more be a economical, more than a political one. But anyway, years ago when the SUV started to become popular, everyone wants to make a SUV. Now Bentley and Maserati, they all have SUV. And I looked at BMWs. They go from X1 to X7. And are they going to come up with X8 and 9? And same with the sedans. So from that respect, is it similar to the political system where they go from a stable, 3 or 4 lines to like 7, 8 lines?
Well, I love metaphors, and but I've learned not to over push them. So an interesting idea. I could use that for another version. Thank you. The serious question, which I was going to start you going to talk about, is what's going to happen to the German auto industry moving forward. And they got some problems. They've got some serious problems, and the main problem is that even though they've been watching it coming, it's sort of like the wedding in Monty Python's wedding. The soldiers are watching the threat coming, and then they don't react. The main problem is electrical vehicles, and what they are now facing is a tidal wave of high quality Chinese-made electrical vehicles, BYD in the forefront, who are not only apparently quite good, but they also have a whole bunch of electronics. And the Germans have been having a lot of difficulty getting into that area. So I hope that Mercedes does an XZ or something to challenge this. And it's going to be it's part of the German dilemma that they face on the economic front. It's a big part of their economy.
Unfortunately, we're really running short on time. But can we take a couple of questions? Just collect a couple of questions. Let's start with Nikki. And then we'll take you, and then I saw Kevin Blackmore. So 3 quick questions and then an answer. Nikki, you want to start?
Just want to add on a little on the automobile side, because I think that's a topic you have not even looked at. The Germans obviously decided 25 years ago that they are going to save the world by clean energy. And I think that's one of the problems they have, and you have not touched that at all. So I was trying to hear if you think that part of that problem is that they are so convinced that the world is ending. I mean, talking about a crisis, German young people think the world is ending. So the politics, every step they do is with saving the planet in the back of their mind.
Okay, we're going to take a couple more questions, and then we're going to have to let him wrap.
So first of all, do you think that the election, the election in November in the United States will impact German politics? And if so, what would be the difference between if Trump wins or Biden wins?
Easy question. Easy question. And Mr. Blackmore, you want to ask the last question? Yeah, Kevin.
You mentioned briefly about Ukraine, or you both did, and seeing that Germany is trying to push forward this, but hasn't seen so much support from other European nations, and like France didn't help out as much as expected, and seeing that funds are also held back by Congress here in the United States, how can Germany push forward this idea to help Ukraine as a union of European nations?
Well, these 3 very disparate questions.
Well, actually, the 2 questions fit together. So I'll do middle last, and then I'll go into the automobiles that Nikki asked. Look, the Germans are extremely discomfited by the prospect of another Trump administration. And Trump's comments, which he made about, if if you don't pay your dues, I'll tell the Russians to do whatever the hell they want with you, right? More or less. That sent shockwaves throughout Europe. It kind of sounds like a protection racket. Unfortunately, it's a protection racket which to some extent could work, right? I mean, the NATO without, if the US were suddenly going to pull out of NATO, we would have a serious problem in European security. And so above all, they're concerned about that. Yeah. Now, on a broader scale, I didn't talk about this, we're seeing a rise of not just in Germany, but all across Europe and across in the US to some extent in strange different ways in Turkey and India and very different political systems, a rise of what you could call populism. And there's what you call it, a zeitgeist, to use another German phrase. We are in a moment, and there's certain demonstration effects, right, where you see this. So Trump victory, which talks about a more nationalist, make America great again, less, internationalist approach to the world, will reinforce voices across different political systems, including in Germany, to say, yes, we're right. One of the key things, if you listen to somebody like Alexander Gauland, who is one of the leaders of the AfD, he says, we need a more German foreign policy. We need a more national foreign policy. We should think about our interests and not keep on subordinating ourselves in that direction. So in the short run, yes, it would create fear. On the longer run, it would strengthen a different attitude and the kind of very internationalist attitude which Germany has followed. Germany fights hard for its interests, right? But it has been its willingness, we talked about Peter Katzenstein, he wrote a famous book, Germany has been in some ways a semi-sovereign state. It has given up lots of its sovereign power, in part as a strategy to deal with the outside world. Willst du nicht mein Bruder sein, dann schläge ich dir Schlägelein. If you don't want to be my brother, I'll beat your skull in. Of course, they don't put it that way, but we want to be friends, and you all want us to be friends, don't you? That will become much more difficult. Then we would go back to the German problem. We would have some geostrategic problems that we would recognize from the past. Not the same way. Quote Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. It would be problematic. Now, to your question about the Ukraine, Germany cannot take the lead, but Germany will take a key role in putting together any kind of security, expanded security role. And I think it begins with the defense industry. The defense, I had these debates with people long ago at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik saying, we really should probably think of retaining some of our defense industry. And the senior German guy said he thought I was a representative of what people of the German industry said, that's what people will say to sell their damn weapons. Well, they need their weapons now. They need to modernize the Bundeswehr. They need to build it, reintegrate it into a European system, because it will need to be integrated. This will be a key task. And they can do those things. They can do that with or without Ukraine. Unfortunately, if Ukraine is defeated, whatever that means, if Ukraine is forced to come to some kind of accommodation with Russia, that isn't the end of the world in Europe. Yeah. And it will further accelerate the need for Germany to do this. So I think that that's the direction that they're going to head one way or another. And the prospect of Trump, but even without Trump, the question they ask is it Trump himself, or is Trump a symptom of a deeper reaching change in both the American domestic political system and the world? And that's a question none of us can answer, but it's one that they have to think about. Now, about the automobile, what was the Greens. Well, I can't answer that, except one of my dear friends, Miranda Schröer, who is at the Technische Universität in München. She was one of the high priestesses of Greendom in Germany. And she actually advised Angela Merkel on the nuclear issue. So she's like myself, a German expert. And this was after Fukushima disaster. And so she helped convince Angela Merkel to get out of the nuclear energy business. Now, again, you can have different points of view on the subject, but one of the things we see right now is that German policy has led to a great increase in the cost of energy. The German industry is laboring under a real cost disadvantage. in this area. And that contributes to what I talked about earlier, this new Standortdebatte, this new debate about whether Germany will be, and they're going to have to figure that out. Interesting enough, some of the German companies and scientists, including RWE, have helped create these new atomic plants, these smaller atomic plants, which are much safer than the old generation of power. My personal feeling, I think, folks in the CDU would, many of them would agree with me, is they need to reconsider that policy, those energy policies. Not that, and that doesn't mean you give up being green, right? It's a different way of being green. But on the other hand, if they have to go into coalition with the Greens, good luck. Unfortunately, back to the Weimarization and the problem of coalition building.
Well, it's a long way from that seminar at Harvard where I met this young Turk, coming over from MIT.
And Jim still has most of his hair, and I do not. I'm just looking at, he has changed less than I have.
But no, I'm just thrilled that we were able to work together all these years and to bring you out here to enlighten us a little bit on what's happening in Germany. This is far from the end of the conversation. You're all going to be watching this, especially I look at my students in the back. This will be your generation's question, your generation's issue as well. I don't know if we have any young Germans here, but it's going to be a challenging time. And I'm optimistic that the German people will rise to the challenge, and that they're not going to go back to what we saw in the 1920s and 30s. It's almost unimaginable that something like that could happen today. But please join me in thanking Professor Dr. Berger. And thank you all for making the effort to get here. Stay connected with the Tower Center. Drive safely when you go home tonight, and we'll see you at our next program. Thank you.